Good afternoon, everyone. I am Alejandro Postigo, Senior Lecturer and Course Leader of BA Musical Theatre at the London College of Music, and I am going to talk about my research. The copla musical is the generic term I call it under, but it actually refers to the intercultural adaptation of copla. I'm going to start explaining what is copla, where it comes from, and how I have tried to internationalize it and bring it to the UK through several means. So in this presentation, I'm just going to do an introduction to my work with views to doing a Q&A and a showing of one of the performances later this week on Thursday, to which you are all invited. So in order for you to understand what is copla, just to get a general picture, I will start by saying that these are Spanish folkloric songs that at the same time are self-contained narratives which tell stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end, with Spanish musical features such as flamenco, or some of them coming from the tradition of zarzuela, which is the Spanish musical theater of the 18th and 19th centuries. They were very popularly oriented at the time. They peaked at the time of the 1930s, 1940s, even 1950s during Franco's dictatorship. They have a strong theatrical quality. There's no wonder that they originated in theaters, even though they proliferated in the radio in the 1940s and 50s, and an evocative power. And so these songs were impregnated with political meanings during the dictatorship of Franco, because while artists were, while populations were being exiled and repressed during the dictatorship, people maintained and sustained the ability to dream and think of a different reality thanks to these songs. So they are often associated with Republican ideals and a voice for the minorities. They had to pass censorship in times of political repression, and they share a history of its own. I'm going to comment briefly on the historical background of the songs. So I have put together a very rough timeline of the evolution of musical theater in Europe and America, and you can see the correlations of this evolution with the evolution of Spanish musical theater. So I wanted to highlight how, while opera and operetta had their time in Europe, Spain had its own genre, which is the zarzuela, which, differently to opera and operetta, relied on Spanish typification, Spanish symbols, Spanish stories, and it became later popular in Latin America. But there are really not that many operas and operettas that originated in Spain. It was not considered a popular genre back in the day, and those operas that were performed in Spain were imported. From the zarzuela, there was a bit of influence from the French couplet, and that turned into the variety shows that included copla songs. That originated pretty much at the time where variety shows were at their peak in America. So there were some historical correlations there, and forming the origins of musical theater. And I often like the comparison of copla and timpanelli songs in terms of historical timeline. I understand that the history of musical theatre is way more complex than this diagram, but eventually timpanelli musical comedies turned into book musicals, and from then on is what we've understood as integrated musical theatre that has existed since in America, Britain, and all over the world in this increasing globalization process. So during the last years of Franco's dictatorship in the 1970s, a few American musicals started arriving in Spain, a few even before in the 60s, and translated and performed in Spanish. But there is not a tradition of Spanish musical theater beyond the copla shows. A few musicals have been started to be written lately, but this is mainly a formula following the jukebox musicals, where pre-existing songs are put together into a narrative, and normally from pop singers and songs that are very popular within Spanish society. But the core of musical theatre in Spain at the moment is made up of imported musicals from either America or Britain. Therefore, I started my research in looking into how Anglo musical theatre, and by Anglo I mean musical theatre sung in English, performed in English, written in English, both from Britain and America. It's a dominant model around the world, and putting it together with coplas, an indigenous art form entirely from Spain, could bring a place for an imagined model for Spanish musical theatre to develop, and potentially this model could be applicable to other indigenous cultures. And this led me to create to write and develop the first copla musical. So this was 2011 when I started working in this project in Hoxton Hall, and I started putting together a few copla songs, translating them to English, and creating story to go with them. This is the story of La Gitana, a transgender woman that is fighting with the Republican rebels against Franco's dictatorship. So this is 1939, where the story takes place. La Gitana starts in prison, as we saw in the first slide, and then rescued by the Republicans, joins the cause. She's asked to deliver a message. These are a few production pictures from back then in 2011. Meets an American trader. In the way they fall in love, her mission gets a bit delayed or out of the way, and her comrade Campanera gets assassinated by Franco's regime. She is forced to flee to America because she would be also assassinated back in Spain, and then that would be the end of Act 1. That's as far as the first development took place back in 2011, and I took as a departing source a mixture of dominant paradigms, being the book musical as a narrative that is carrying a story, timpanary musical comedies, although this is not a comedy, but in the sense that copla songs coexisted at the same time as these timpanary songs, and then jukebox musicals in the methodology of bringing back these songs into a completely new narrative. So I studied all three and tried a dramatic adaptation in which I tried to insert an indigenous song form into a foreign structure, which is this jukebox musical structure. The process would entail the integration of self-contained narratives, because each copla song, as I said at the start, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So there are stories within themselves that then had to have a correlation with each other in order to contribute to the narrative. And these open many questions, such as if the project would be a play with songs or a musical, but most importantly, the portrayal of cultural identity, because these songs are very charged with Spanish symbolism. The challenges are of different nature: narrative, music, lyrical, performance-wise, but also the reception of the work, because one of the keys for jukebox musicals to succeed is the understanding of the genre in relation to its previous knowledge, which in this case only Spanish people are familiar with copla songs, but this is not the case anywhere else in the world. The aims of the project were to transform an original performance text that fully integrates traditional copla songs in English, in order to create a hybrid and modernized form of the traditional copla style. So the coplas that you hear in the copla musical are not the original coplas, but an English version that highlights a process of intercultural adaptation. And this, in the long term, is meant to create a way forward for both Spanish and intercultural musical theater projects, reimagining and expanding copla outside of Spain. This led me in 2012 to expand the project into a more professional show with more professional values, a finishing touch, and I developed the story of La Gitana in Act 2, where it taking place in America after she is self-exiled. So La Gitana travels with her mother to New York, following her lover, the American trader, which in the play is called El Americano. That's him. And he is creating opportunities for La Gitana to perform in several venues, such as the Ritz Hotel. Eventually, La Gitana creates a name for herself. She is accomplishing professional goals, is becoming a bit of a famous singer in America. But then she is somehow nostalgic and reminiscent of her life in Spain. She meets an unknown comrade that is reminding her of her past and her life and her significance. And eventually, she has like a middle life crisis and decides to go back to join the cause, the resistance against Franco, and fight with the Republicans. And this is the ghost of her old comrade Campanera that was killed in the first act. So in doing this project, with these production values, we collaborated with Spanish actors to play the Spanish parts, and then British and American to play the El Americano, for instance. And this brought up the correlation of musical theatre and interculturalism, which involves a collaboration and appropriation, which brings forward artworks that combine elements from separate cultures and their indigenous artistic traditions. This is in Carl Weber's words, or the meeting in the moment of performance of two or more cultural traditions. So that meeting in the moment manifested not only in performance, but also in reworking the copla songs, the lyrics, the narratives. I collaborated with two British lyricists, a British MD, and I wrote the libretto myself, but there was always a dialogue in which we questioned how much had to be altered in order to create an understanding for an international but mainly British audience, and to what extent the original copla material, Spanish culture, had to be preserved within the songs and the narrative. So the adaptation posed a series of challenges of dramaturgical, musical, and then of performance and reception nature. And I'm going to talk through some of them. Unfortunately, some of the videos that I had planned to show are not going to show because of the problems, technical problems that I'm having with PowerPoint, but I will talk you through it in the hope that you can imagine what these challenges entail. So in terms of lyric adaptations, for instance, we can study rhythm and structure, as is the case with the opening number, The Jailer of the Port, from the original copla song Carceleras del Puerto. The Jailer of the Port follows a bulería rhythm, bulería structure that you're seeing now on the screen, and where you see a number in brackets, that's the tempo that is accentuated within the rhythm. So starting to count on the 11th, this rhythm would go 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Where you hit a clap, it's the main beat. And it would count either that way or through the variation 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So the original score of this bulería rhythm, Carceleras del Puerto, would read like this: Mejor quisiera estar muerto. That if you put together with the bulería rhythm, we go 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mejor quisiera estar muerto. And so it's accentuating different beats that the song would naturally accentuate in English, especially if we take into consideration the translation. So the English lyrics within this bulería rhythm would go, I'd rather die than go on living. And so the accents, the prosody falls in a very odd place. In this case, than rather than die, which is the main verb. So we had to do some modifications so that the accent would fall on the most reasonable word, like I'd rather die than go on living. I'd rather drown than go on breathing. And this alters significantly the bulería rhythm. So this is a compromise that, for instance, I had to make in order to make the songs more understandable in the new language. It doesn't fully destroy the bulería rhythm, but it compromises it, and the performer needs to be aware of that when he or she is singing the song, which is what I would have liked to show you in the video. Here's another example. Que pase la noche entera. That would translate for all of the world colliding, for all of the land dividing. And we want to emphasize the words world, land, colliding, dividing. For all of the world colliding, for all of the land dividing. That's how the tune goes. In terms of narrative structure, the song is made of two verses, a bridge and a chorus, which is kind of a AABC structure. We find that structure a lot in a lot of timpanali songs. And we see in the first verse, we hear about the situation and the emotional state of the character. In the second verse, the antagonists are introduced. In the bridge, an idea of hope, because it goes from minor to major. And then in the chorus, we go back to the present situation, bringing back the status quo. That's why I thought that would be a good example for this number. Here we have a description of the lyrics. I'd rather die than go on living. I'd rather drown than go on breathing. I'm watching the ship sail gently. This is La Gitana speaking from the prison of Santa Maria. Behind walls in Santa Maria, strangers guard me when sleeping. She's talking about the guards that are guarding her cell, blaming for, they are the ones to blame for all of the world colliding and the land dividing. However, she's looking outside the window and she says that she's watching a sailboat go across the sea. Some say it goes to America, which anticipates the idea that she's going to eventually end up there. And eventually she's lamenting her fate, the disaster of the war. I'm not going to go through the lyrics in detail as we can't unfortunately listen to the song. Here's another example. It has to do with rhyme as well. Musical theatre songs generally rely on consonant rhyme, which is the most popular rhyme in English, but rhyme in Spanish is very reliant on assonance, and so many of the rhymes here, like Mostrador with Amor, are heavily assonant, but they are recognized as rhymes. Now, when we try assonance in English, it doesn't have the same effect. So bar with heart is not really recognized as a rhyme. The same applies to tattoo and I knew. However, we had to do those compromises in order to preserve some of the lyrics of the song and make it sound within the same language parameters that we have the original song. So whenever a rhyme was allowed to be assonant, it was transformed as consonant. Then the changes were applied, but otherwise, an assonant rhyme was very much encouraged. And this made me think of the play Educating Rita, where they question assonance versus consonants and whether there is right or wrong. And she, in the play, as they are comparing a rhyme, Frank the teacher asks her and to comment on an example of assonance, and she answers, yeah, means getting the rhyme wrong. So that also responds to the idea for many audience members that won't recognize assonance as a rhyme, and that could be seen as problematic as it's so prevalent in Spanish rhyming. Another thing that we had to take into consideration were grammatical features. So from the Spanish original into the final version of the lyrics, things had to move around quite a bit. And so if we go from the sentence errante lo busco por todos los puertos, which literally translates wandering, I'm searching for him at the ports, that doesn't sound entirely right, and it needs to be rewritten following grammatic considerations. Therefore, reading, since then I've been searching and wandering the ports. That is even retouched further by a lyricist that comes back saying, since that day I've wandered and searched all the dockyard. And so following this process, we'll see that the Spanish original is following this structure of indirect object, the subject is omitted, which is not present, then the verb and the direct object. Then in English very much, it seems that we need a subject for clarity, then a verb, and then both objects, indirect and direct. With the lyrical transformation, the lyricist transformation, we maintain subject and verb, but he adds a second verb and a direct object, so that the sentence, if I may go back one slide, ends up being, since that day I've wandered and searched, second edition, all the dockyard. So it doesn't matter who she is searching for, because we understand. And then eventually, not a soul has heard of or once seen his face, which is a strong transformation from, and to other sailors I ask about him, the literal translation from the Spanish. Finally, the last example that I would want to consider is semantic considerations, which very much have to do with cultural sensitivity. So here you have an example of a literal translation of one verse in a copla song, saying, if you ever ask me to open my veins, a river of blood would splash on my face. This is seen as very gore, very extreme, and it doesn't have the desired effect that we would like. So in cases like this, the lyrics have been adapted. I think in this case it ended up being, if you ever ask me to cut my veins open, I'd bleed out a river of reddest carnation, describing the color of the blood but without mentioning the blood directly. Another example of semantic considerations is when the literal translation talks about life and death, that is simplified, well, that is rewritten as my voice and my silence to not be so extreme. It feels that Spanish lyrics are very much going for melodrama. And so the process that is embedded in all of this is a cultural variant, performing someone else's culture, a process of translation that is different, viscerally experiential. So it's not only translated so that we can hear the original meanings, but rather reinterpret those meanings. It's not translating a book. Intercultural exchange takes a teacher, someone who knows the body of performance of the culture being translated. This is why I considered it important to have a Spanish presence in the creative team. Not only myself looking at the original content of the lyric, but also performers who were familiar with the original material. So therefore, the translator of the culture is not a mere agent, as a translator of words might be, but also a culture bearer. And I think the whole cast was very conscious that this is what was at stake in this project. So moving on, this was the Coppola musical in 2012 and 2013, where it performed with an ensemble of 8 and a band of 3 or 4, depending on each particular performance and iteration. We did a couple of performances at the Roundhouse and another few at the Collisions Festival. And eventually, production-wise, it was very difficult to sustain. So in 2014, I rewrote the project as a solo, and therefore I performed the story of La Gitana from the perspective of a narrator that is looking back into this figure, investigating who she was, what was her migration history, her experience in America, her relevance to the Spanish Civil War, to the Republican cause. And then this narrator is starting to identify with her almost 100 years later in England, and identifying with the experience of the immigrant, the experience of self-exile, in this case for economic reasons, the experience also of sexual identity, trying to understand what is the process that she went through back then, back in the day, and eventually going through the same process himself, becoming La Gitana, both characters merging into one, to the point that this narrator decides to leave his life in England aside, go back to Spain, and follow his principles like La Gitana did. So these two characters meet in different historical timelines, and that eventually worked very interestingly. It's been performed in several festivals around the world. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But before I do, I want to comment on the performance that you are going to see on Thursday, which is the Coppola Cabaret. And this new iteration of the show was a more dynamic performance, more interactive, trying to bring to the forefront the research behind this project. Not so much from a narrative perspective, but from a perspective of transformation of Coppola. So the Coppola Cabaret tried to confront the audience with the idea of making them feel what the performer feels, trying to explain Coppola to a pool of international audiences and make them like it and even love it. So there are a couple of case studies and examples that the protagonist goes through, comparing Coppola to musical theatre, exploring its self-contained narratives, studying the idea of subversion and political agendas of Coppola, and also the idea of cultural representation and the homeland that many songs talk about. So these are pictures from the show that you will be able to see on Thursday, and how, in relation to the sound of music, what's the place of Coppola, and in translation, how can the narratives be presented in this new context, in terms of subversion, how the star impersonators, transvestites, and drag artists have rescued the form in the 21st century, and eventually the idea of going back to Spain, where Coppola belongs. The audience is brought on board and made sing a Coppola song in English, and this is pretty much what the project is exploring, the Coppola Cabaret. So that was 2015, and from 2016 to 2019, there hasn't been anything in 2020 so far. There was an internationalization of this process beyond England and Spain. The Coppola musical has so far featured at these festivals, including the Tristan Bates Theatre in the West End, but also in Seville, Bulgaria, Bolivia, in New York, and the Coppola Cabaret has gone to the Czech Republic, also Bulgaria, Plymouth, Vitoria in Spain, which is the Basque country. In every international context, Coppola experiences a different reception based on the previous knowledge of the form. It's quite interesting, for instance, when we perform in Spain the Coppola musical with Coppola songs in English, and the audiences are so familiar with these songs and they are hearing them in English for the first time, and the experience is quite subversive in a way, because back in the day they were used to evoke different worlds, and now they are brought back in a completely different form and shape. Equally, in Latin America, there's an inheritance of Coppola that the older generations can make that link, and it's quite interesting to see. My aim with this project is to keep exploring the international adaptation and accessibility to this form, and making it available to audiences from all around the world. It's a song type that represents a period in Spanish history, but it's also full of poetry, and it's also the seed, the beginning of musical theatre in Spain as we know it. So I think that's a moment in time to look back, to keep building a history of musical theatre in Spain that can be exported anywhere else in the world. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, that you find it interesting in some ways, and if you want to hear more about it, I look forward to seeing you on Thursday when we will have a chance to discuss and ask some questions after watching the performance of the Copla Cabaret. Thank you very much.